Hello everyone. Welcome to the sixth Coastal Connections workshop, where our theme for today is storytelling with Indigenous and intangible heritage. If you don't know already, I'm Dr. Alex Kent. It's my privilege to lead the Coastal Connections project, which is a joint initiative between World Monuments Fund and English Heritage to build a global network for sharing knowledge, experience, and practical solutions amongst those who manage or care for coastal heritage around the world. WMF is headquartered in New York. It's the leading independent organization devoted to safeguarding the world's most treasured places to enrich people's lives and to build mutual understanding across cultures and communities. With affiliate offices in other countries, including the UK, where Coastal Connections is based, WMF has been involved in over 800 conservation projects since it was founded in 1965. So we'll be celebrating our 60th anniversary next year. English Heritage is a charity that cares for over 400 sites and their collections in England for the benefit of this and for future generations. Its work is informed by the values of authenticity, quality, imagination, responsibility, and fun. And its vision is that people will experience the story of England where it really happened. It just so happens actually that today I'm joining you from Fort Brockhurst near Portsmouth in England, which was built in the 1860s and today is looked after by English Heritage. Hopefully we'll try and do this in future as well, a bit of a roving location. So we also like to know where people are joining us from. So please feel free to say hello in the chat, but where you're coming from, especially if you manage a coastal heritage site. It's always great to see who we've got with us today when we have our workshop. And if you haven't already filled in our Coastal Connection survey, please do so. It takes about 10 minutes and it really helps us to know more about the challenges facing coastal heritage sites, and obviously then also how we can develop useful resources for the Coastal Connections Network. It's good that we have some responses in already to the questionnaire, but obviously we'd like a lot more. So please feel free to do that. And the link is in the chat. So just to give you a bit of an idea of how we're going to run today. So we'll hear from our speakers first, and then after, usually we'll have a brief question and answer session. We'll discuss the topic in breakout rooms. But before we hear from the individual speakers who'll be talking out specific case study sites or their experiences of intangible and Indigenous heritage, I'm going to hand over to Anne Cuss, who's going to introduce our theme for today. So Anne joined World Monuments Fund as Regional Director of North America in 2021. Her work encompasses all aspects of cultural heritage for a variety of public, private and government partnerships with a focus on public lands. Anne's professional role includes performing on-site condition assessments, hands-on treatments, and training for emerging historic preservation professionals. She coordinates multidisciplinary teams of historic tradespeople, heritage specialists, and stakeholders for a holistic preservation approach. So, Anne, I'm delighted that we have you with us joining us today, and over to you. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And hello, everybody. Welcome to today's workshop. And thank you to our colleagues at WMF UK and English Heritage for hosting this event today. As you just heard, if you're just joining us, my name is Anne Cuss, and I am World Monuments Fund Regional Director of North America. Very happy to be here to discuss something near and dear to me and to really all of us at WMF, and that is Indigenous heritage and our role in safeguarding not only the places, but the stories and people who make them meaningful. Now, I thought we'd start off the event today by discussing the role of traditional knowledge in heritage management. And because this is a workshop and not a panel, we're just going to jump in. So if we could have the next slide. Simply put, this is a very, very broad overview just because we're short on time. But when we talk about traditional knowledge, we're referring to the know-how, skills, and practices that are developed, sustained, and passed on from generation to generation within a community, often forming part of its cultural or spiritual identity. Now, a lot of the places that World Monuments Fund works, particularly in the North America region, center the project development process on this notion. Why do we do this? Well, there's a couple good reasons. So these strategies are often time tested. In many cases, they have been developed over millennia by communities who are adapting to both social and environmental selective pressures. That could be anything from changes in access to resources like foodstuffs, geographic location, water is always a big one. And these are caused by natural weather events, conflict, or simply the ravages of time. This type of knowledge is critical as a heritage management framework because it is generational knowledge, specialized, it's cultivated over time, It is both directly observable through behavioral modeling and instruction, but also is expressed through oral histories, traditions, adding a layer of enculturation by passing down ideas, significance, and memory of a group's past and present. This kind of thing fosters social cohesion between in-group members and out-group members. I think it's fairly obvious that working together reinforces ideas and narratives of those belonging to a social group. There's also value in finding ways to co-creatively manage and collaborate on heritage stewardship, that's site, story, or object-based things, to find practices that integrate traditional knowledge, but also keep knowledge protected and accessible. And we can talk about an example of that from my region of North America in literally a minute. Lastly, all of this thing as a management kind of framework, it helps us rebalance power dynamics between stakeholders, community members, and the policies and practices that are performed both on site and on paper. We can go to the next slide, please. So traditional knowledge encompasses the physical and non-physical expressions of culture. You see in the bottom right corner here, this vernacular architecture, this example of a Pueblo dwelling in the Southwest. This is an obvious physical representation of a group's identity. But intangible heritage covers a wide range of activities and ideas that can be expressed through dance, like you see on the left of the screen at this powwow here, food and plant life, which is choya, and storytelling itself. And often as outsiders, we perceive this as myth, but we as good anthropologists know that myth is really a well-known story that explains primary principles, beliefs, and values outside of chronological time. So all these things factor into Indigenous knowledge, identity, and how those things are expressed through story and narrative. We can go to the next slide, please. So just to contextualize this just a little tiny bit, because we're short on time, I wanted to discuss two sites from the WMF Watch, both in North America. Here on the left, we have a historical pictograph plate associated with the Eshtokna of Garcia Pasture, 2022 WMF Watch site. We don't have a lot of time to get into it, but what's represented is what I wanted to share with you as an example of what's left to represent the culture. For the Eshtokna, who are based in Brownsville, Texas, in the United States, much of their heritage is inaccessible due to issues with the government, lack of protections, and in some places, impacts from tidal and coastal flooding that is slowly creeping inland to what we know are village and rock art sites associated with the tribe. So these plates were documented some 100, 150 years ago. For a lot of reasons, this is the only thing left, and these are based solely off of narratives, the myths, the stories that are shared through tribal generations. Here on the right, we have a traditional dwelling from a site in the canyons of the Cedar Mesa region of Bears Ears National Monument in southeastern Utah in the United States. Though higher on the ground, the site faced similar issues when drought hit the region between 150 and 950 AD, causing a drastic shift in how resources were used and the social structure of Puebloan communities. This is the kind of a hotly debated, contested thing. We won't get into it, but I wanted to show you this to get you thinking about what happens when the tangible is gone. How do we tell stories when all we have left are the words to describe places? Tangible cultural materials are essential to that. But as we face increasingly challenging natural phenomena, like many of our coastal heritage sites and speakers are today, how can we protect the memory of rapidly changing sites? Alex asked me to do the intro to get people thinking. And so here's your first existential dilemma of the session. At what point does tangible become intangible? As these changes occur, as these events, these 100-year storms and intensity of these storms occur more and more, we will have to start thinking about how we can use storytelling when the physical places are gone. So next slide, please. So with that in mind, because we're almost at time, I challenge you today as we go through our session to think of traditional knowledge and how it can shape our practice participatory processes, and how can we adapt it to coastal sites. And slide, please. How can we use storytelling to communicate effective, replicable strategies that safeguard Indigenous and intangible heritage based on those knowledge systems? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Stephen Battle, WMF's Principal Project Director and our leader for our work in Sub-Saharan Africa.
That's excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Anne. Brilliant to have that really stimulating introduction. So indeed, what I'll just say before handing over to Stephen is if you've got any questions for any of our speakers, please put them in the chat and we'll then address them after all speakers are presented. We've got about 10 minutes for looking at questions, so not a huge amount of time. but we'll use that time before then breaking out into the smaller groups for the discussions. So if you've got a question, just put it in the chat and then we'll select those and put them to the speakers at the end. So let's crack straight on then and move to Stephen Battle, who you already have heard is Principal Project Director at World Monuments Fund, where he leads WMS projects in sub-Saharan Africa. Stephen is an architect with 30 years of professional experience managing conservation projects in Africa, Middle East and Asia. And we're really delighted to have you with us, Stephen, today. So over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Great. Thanks for that, Alex. Now go to the next slide, please. Let's jump straight in. And thanks for the introduction, Anne. I'm happy to say that some of the things that you touched upon will come through as we go through my presentation. I think some of the other presentations as well. So first thing I'd say, of course, is that, you know, as I think we can probably all agree, the distinction between tangible and intangible heritage on one level is really vanishingly small. Because it's the intangible aspects of a site, the stories, myths associated with it, etc., that give those places, that site, meaning and make it significant. Without those stories, it's just bricks and mortar. And as I say, I think we can probably all agree on that. Next slide, please. So most of my work is in sub-Saharan Africa. And now that poses particular problems and risks, because when we implement conservation, whether we like it or not, there is always a power asymmetry involved, and Anne touched upon that in her introduction. We are outsiders. We usually control the money. That's just the way it is. We bring knowledge. Knowledge is power. Often we bring skills that are not available locally, etc. All of these things put us as outsiders in a position of power. Now, when I say outsiders, I don't just refer to World Monuments Fund as an organization from the global north. A government heritage organization from the capital is also an outsider, because that capital could be hundreds of kilometers from the site. It could be a completely different ethnic group, even speak a completely different language. And you find that in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. With all that power, excluding local actors from decision-making is an easy trap to fall into. But if we exclude local actors, then we risk diluting their ownership. More importantly, we risk making it no longer their story, but some Disney-fied ersatz version of itself. Now, you may think this is self-evident. You may say minimal intervention, like with light, etc., blah, 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 good conservation practice. But what I would argue that is equally important is process. The principle should always be, I would suggest, not for us, without us. In other words, if you are not involving me in the process, then it is not really for me. Again, this seems self-evident, but it is often ignored. So I want to present a case study in the south of Tanzania. Go to the next slide, please. Where we proactively set out to embed what we were doing embed the community are living around the site in the process of conservation. This case study is Kua, which is on an island, off the coast of southern Tanzania. It's part of the Mafia Island archipelago. It's still one of the lowest income parts of Tanzania. What they're rich in is the ocean and history. Next slide, please. Kua was a Swahili city-state, one of many along the coast, first settled in the 11th century, reached its peak in the 17th century, and started a sort of a long demise in the 18th century. When we started work there, it was basically a ruin. But there had been no redevelopment of the site. In other words, no resettlement of the site since it had been abandoned, which meant that it was very rich in archaeological resources. But the ruins were slowly crumbling. Next slide, please. The first thing we did when we started work was facilitate the establishment of a community-based organization, the so-called Kua Ancient Town Preservation Society, which was registered as an NGO in Tanzania. And this CBO, as we call it, has been our partner throughout. The central tenet behind this was that the CBO is empowered to collect the entrance fee from visitors in exchange for carrying out certain management and maintenance responsibilities at the site. And then a percentage of that revenue has to be reinvested back into maintaining the site. Capital of Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, is a long way away from Mafia, and the local heritage organization, NMT, does not have the resources to manage the site directly. So this is really a win-win situation for everyone. It sounds obvious, but in fact, it was the first such public-private partnership in Tanzania, and NMT should be applauded for their courage in allowing us to facilitate that. So throughout the 3 phases of work we've implemented there, the CBO has worked closely with us in several key ways. First, we used the CBO bank account to funnel funds, all the funds for conservation work that went to Mafia. This was pragmatic for us, but it also means that the village community on Juwani Island could see how much money comes in and how much was being spent. Now, of course, this doesn't altogether remove the power relationship. We retain co-signature, but it makes the process transparent rather than just some decisions being made sort of in some remote place. People could see what was being invested in heritage, and I suggest this increases their sense of ownership over the process. Next slide, please. Second key role the CBO played was to manage the local workforce. And from the outset, we wanted to spread the benefit of the investment as widely as possible on the island. So the CBO organized a rotation of workers and craftspeople who joined us at the site. And during each phase, we employed up to 15% of the island's population, which is a very significant number. Why is this important? Well, first, because it ensures money enters the local economy. Economists talk in terms of a multiplier effect of up to 1.4%. So that means for every dollar invested, the money in circulation, or very crudely, wealth, increases by up to 1.4%. Now, this, of course, is particularly important for women, because it's generally accepted now that wages in women's pockets leads to direct improvement in outcomes in terms of health and education for the whole family. So employing women was an essential step to spread that benefit. Second reason it was important to ask the CBO to help us select the workforce is because it means the community living around the site directly benefited from that process. So it's not some vague notion of conservation, saving their heritage. It's money into their pockets. And so I come back to this fundamental principle of not for us without us. And I would suggest that direct financial benefit means it is a benefit for them in a very direct way. Next slide, please. So at the conclusion of 3 phases of work, the site had been transformed from a few walls covered in dense bush to a place where the outlines of the medieval town and traces of a lost community could be easily discerned. Next slide. We undertook restoration on one of the structures at the site, so-called madrasa. Next slide. And we used this as an interpretation center. Next slide, please. And the panels, the next slide, please. The panels include stories about the site and about the communities living around it. So what have we achieved? Apart from conservation of one of the most important Swahili sites in East Africa, I will argue that the process I have described reinforces a sense of ownership. It places responsibility for stewardship in the hands of the village community, and in that way ensures that this heritage remains their story. Next slide, please. So some takeaways. What are the lessons from this case study? First, process matters. It's as conservation people, we often get focused on the end result. Of course we do, because that's how people judge us, whether we like it or not. But for me, I would argue very strongly that process is just as important as that end result, for all of the reasons that I've described before. Number 2, Conservation is the second lesson, is that in this context, conservation is about co-creation. It cannot be about experts arriving and imposing a version of history, of heritage on the local beneficiaries. It has to be a process of co-creation. And I think Lucy's going to touch on that in the next talk. And for me, it's absolutely fundamental. Third point, third lesson, the third takeaway I would say is devolve power, systematically devolve power. It's important who sits at the table when you're making decisions, because if those asymmetries that are always there are not addressed, then the local agents, local networks of agents are very quickly excluded from decision making. So again, as I said, the key question is who's at the table. Fourth, develop skills. One of the reasons local agents are unable to participate in co-creation is because they lack skills or knowledge. So again, systematically investing in skill development, investing in increasing knowledge is a key aspect of devolving power. And thirdly, as I say, spread the benefits. Be systematic about that. So final thing to say, big shout out to the real star of this story, Albert Abel, our site architect, who managed this process. He started with us as a student, ended up at the end of phase one, is running the site. And he's now the go-to conservation architect in Tanzania. So in terms of investing for the future, Albert is one of our, if I may say, our main success stories. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Stephen. It's really excellent to see the value of process that matters, not just being about the end result, something that we all have to, I think, really take to heart. That's excellent. Right, let's move straightly on then quickly on to Lucy, Professor Lucy Blue. Some of you, I'm sure, will know, of course, if you're into maritime archaeology. So Lucy, Professor in Maritime Archaeology at the University of Southampton and the Maritime Archaeological Director of the Honor Frost Foundation. Lucy has conducted maritime archaeological and ethnographic research in the Western Indian Ocean, the Eastern Mediterranean and the Gulf, and has a deep interest in old boats and the coastal communities that use them. And we're delighted to have you with us, Lucy. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. And thank you also, Stephen. I think you've underpinned some really important messages that I probably haven't said quite so clearly as you did. But I think the other thing that I need to say about our project that you can see the title of, can I have the next slide, please, is this is, it is very much based on co-creation. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute, but it's more of a, I guess that you could use the word of flyby. It's certainly in terms of the involvement that myself and my partner, John Cooper from the University of Exeter, played in this. And really the pivotal person in this whole project was Icham Baki from the University of Dar es Salaam, because he provided us the inn to the site of Bagamoyo, which you can see is just north of where Stephen was working, opposite the island of Zanzibar. And he also provided that continuity, which I'll come back to afterwards, which I think is very important in terms of that sustainability. So our next slide, please. Oh, yes, I need to also mention, as Stephen referenced, the role of the students, Ishambaki students, who were absolutely pivotal to also the gaps that when we were not present on the island, at the site, and also the community itself, because this was very much starting from the community level. The first action that we did was to have a workshop to discuss what was important to them. And in fact, even prior to that, and I think this all speaks to what Stephen was talking about in terms of heritage assets, the site of Bagamoyo is steeped in history, from a trading centre in the nearby Koile to the big role that Bagamoyo played in terms of the slave industry in Africa. And also it has a resonant colonial past. And you can see here the Boma, which was the German headquarters. And it's quite interesting that actually the community's connection with heritage is not seen in any of this tangible heritage, but the ocean as a primary asset because it was at the basis of their livelihood. So I think, again, it's a question of next point, please. Sorry, I shouldn't have put so many pointers in, but the perceptions of heritage and whose heritage is, what heritage equals to different people. So that's that little thing at the bottom. Thank you, Kira. So next slide. So in that context, we have this amazing site of Bagamoyo, being a boat nerd, as Alex has just indicated. The site is incredible. It's full of a whole range of different boats. And that was our driver, myself and John. But when we entered into this partnership with Itch and Baki, we realized that there was a whole range of challenges that faced us. The coastal development that was planned, massive overfishing. I would just flick through this if you wouldn't mind, Kira. Thank you. Limited legislative framework. And I think the point you made, Stephen, about that disconnect from central government was something that we definitely found a challenge. This, different perceptions of heritage, focused on the built heritage versus the intangible, the practice, population growth, climate change. Another big challenge was the increasing amount of tourism in Bagamoyo, both local but also international, and that created some different challenges in the sense of tourists wandering along beaches taking pictures and the resentment that can often build up. So this sort of I guess the gaze of the tourists, as it were, and that was another thing. And then, ultimately the fact that we were dealing with, as I'll show you in a minute, a range of different stakeholders with all different agendas, and the baseline lack of visibility of the maritime community in many ways. Even though they occupied the beaches, they were dealing with the fishing, etc., they weren't very visible to many people, really. So next slide, please. So very quickly, our project objectives based on co-creation without any doubt, and that really formed a firm basis. So from a documentary perspective, we were interested in recording everything that moved, the boats, the fishing practice, the techniques, the instruments, but also that's part of that knowledge creation as well, because when you record the object, you're also talking to them about how they use the object, how they build the objects, and the knowledge that's inherent in that process. So we ran on this co-created basis a number of workshops. We had a national and local exhibition. I'll talk a bit about that later. And we deployed over time, and it was only really 3 seasons, I think, with the continuity of the students in between, a number of what we hoped would be strategies to leverage this visibility, the social and economic benefit of maritime heritage in the region. We worked with the local municipalities and national governments to try and raise the profile and address the lack of legislation and policy in this respect. Unfortunately, I don't think that was so successful, and I think it's because of that divide and interest. The blah blah, as you said, Stephen, and we obviously brought visibility through the traditional ways of publication. Next slide, please. So just briefly, we were really dealing with a plurality of landscapes. Bagamoyo has the boat builders, the repairing, the fishermen, the gatherers, and the women who do a lot of gathering, but there's a big market there serving Zanzibar. So you have the cargo traders, and this rhythm of beach life was really apparent, driven by the tides, but with all these different people having different activities. And we couldn't possibly try and record everything or document everything or discuss everything. It was just too much. But so we focused on the first 2. Next slide, please. And so just to sort of very quickly think about what we learned from this process. So the documenting itself, and as I've said, that process of documenting. So for example, the Ungalao, which is this beautiful dugout logboat with double outriggers, top right, and some of our drawings turn the bottom. We actually processed the whole build from selection by the lovely Mr. Alalay through to the launch of this boat, which was videoed and interviewed continuously. And the interview process, I think, was really important because it gave us the chance to talk to people about what was important to them, how they use their boats, how they use their fishing equipment. We learned, as you'll see from the bottom right slide, a lot about the knowledge of fishing, a knowledge of sailing, the knowledge of the seasons, the environment, the different fishing banks, the names, and how these names connected with practice and their understanding of the different types of fish and the seasons. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please, Chiara?
Sorry, it seems to be taking a while. It should come up now.
Yes, it should have been here. Just keep run through these. I think it's the easiest thing. So basically, I would see the other thing that we did was give some degree of voice and visibility to the fishing and boat building communities in Bagamoyo. The visibility came in the form of a really successful exhibition. Now, having done 2 seasons of field work and taken lots of photographs with permission, and then gathered our information, we then put together an exhibition. But it wasn't just with Ichimbaki and his students, but it was also with the boat builders and the fishermen. So that when everybody turned up, the school children and the local dignitaries even arrived, we were very lucky, they were then able to make connection with the stories of these people, and the people themselves could see themselves being visible, giving them a slightly different status within society, which I think was really interesting. We also worked with one of Ichimbaki's students, Claudia, or Chemical as she's known, and produced a series of songs, which basically people listen to on buses across Tanzania. So they're hearing about maritime heritage in the songs, the policy meetings and the publications. But in terms of the more sustainable outputs, I see one of the initiatives that Ichibaki took actually before we arrived was working with the Keole tondo and basket making ladies. You see them at the bottom, very much in line with your work that you were doing in Kua, Stephen. But also we set up, because we could see there were disparate boat builders there, some resident, some transitory, doing similar things but not working together. So we helped them set up and establish it officially, an NGO called a Boat Builders Association, Chamba Boma, which then brought them together, and it gave them the resources to work together, but also produce boats that then could be used to take the tourists out. So again, it comes back to the point that we're making about trying to make this sustainable, both in terms of forging partnerships, but also bringing in an income, because that's absolutely critical. And that works very well with the Kaole ladies with their baskets and their tondo. Next slide, please. I think I'm nearly there.
Got about a minute left, Lucy.
Yeah,
okay.
I think I'm on my last one. So effective, I'm taking the question, effective, how effective has this been? Well, the challenges are definitely working with a range of stakeholders, particularly when you have this disconnect between central government and lack of policy, and even a range of different gatekeepers on the ground, and from the tourists to the fish people. And we didn't make so much progress, regrettably, so far anyway, despite having a number of policy forums with that legislative side. But working with local partners was absolutely critical. Ichimbaki's input and the continuity that his team provided, after we've left, we literally ran off as COVID was approaching. And that co-creation, co-produced approach was also critical, because it meant that we were asking the local maritime communities what they wanted, rather than what we thought they wanted. The establishment of those organizations, as I've said, obviously documenting for prosperity. And I hope that all of this raised visibility. So thank you. The last one is a big thank you from the Chamba Boma team. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lucy. Again, such a fascinating talk, and really underlining and highlighting the importance of co-creation and what that means for empowering local communities. I think in many, many ways, the plurality of all of those different forms of heritage. That's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Just a reminder to everyone, feel free to put questions in the chat, and then we'll address those after we've heard all 4 speakers. We'll come back to the questions, but feel free to put them in the chat as they drop into your mind. Let's now move then straight to Maida Owens, our next speaker. So welcome, Maida, a folklorist who has directed the Louisiana Division of the Arts Folklife Program since 1988. The Folklife Program is a partner organization of the Bayou Culture Collaborative, an initiative of the Louisiana Folklore Society. So we're going to zoom across the Atlantic Ocean now to find Louisiana, and hopefully, quite literally, we will see Maida hopefully waiting for us. So over to you, Maida. Really welcome. Glad to have you with us. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I'm going to be talking not about a site, but all of South Louisiana. So this is not, we do not manage any sites whatsoever. The main thing we do is try to help the various concerns in Louisiana have a place to share their stories. And related to the theme of this workshop, many community members have shared their stories with and we help the policymakers and the environmentalists and the planners hear more perspectives. So that's how we relate to this. Next slide. The overarching questions for the Bayou Culture Collaborative is a lot of concern about climate migration and what we should be doing now. How can we help communities get ready to welcome or to better welcome newcomers? Because they're welcoming them now. There's Louisiana for the first time is depopulating as a state. So they're moving within the state and they're moving outside of the state. Next slide. Next slide. So we ask these questions. What happens to our cultures as migration increases? And very importantly, what will future generations wish we had done? So getting down into more like, what do you do? What do we need to be doing now to address the human dimension in planning? And the answer that we've heard and moved towards is that culture needs to be in the community resilience conversation. Next slide. And until this time, very few arts and culture people were in the conversation. So that's what, a lot of what we're doing. Anne touched on this and the other presentations too, is why culture. And when I started this, I was really unfamiliar with the planning and environmental worlds. But what I ended up learning was that the way culture fits into everything is about social cohesion. It provides a sense of well-being and community connections that will help people adapt with all the disruption. But we also tell people that if there is a tradition that you really want to pass on, you're going to have to do it with intention with this much disruption. No, culture will not go away. It will not completely fade. But if there's something you specifically value, you're going to need to pass it on with intention. Next slide. So the Louisiana Folklore Society responded by creating the Bayou Culture Collaborative. Our mission is to help people sustain their traditional cultures and to help people connect in the face of land loss and climate change. So we're basically a forum for people to exchange ideas and push ideas out. We have 2 university centers, 2 nonprofits, and my state government agency. I'm within the Louisiana Division of the Arts in the state. Next slide. The main thing and the most visible thing that we do is what we call the Bayou Culture Gatherings. And these are monthly online gatherings. They're free. Anybody can participate. And we do have even international participation. And this is where environmentalists, artists, tradition bearers, researchers, and policymakers can attend and share ideas. We present for 1 hour. There is a discussion time very similar to this. And then what's really interesting is the 30 minutes afterwards that is not recorded and posted on YouTube. We have even more meaningful conversations. A lot of people are shy about having their conversations posted on YouTube, so we allow that. So these are just 2 examples of the everyone we've had. Let's see, our first one was in January of 2022. So this is a very recent initiative. Next slide. We were doing things before that, but the gathering started that. After the very first gathering, they decided, we didn't have, without any kind of prompting, they said, we need a position statement. So they also said we need a working group. So one of the working groups took this on, and about 50 people participated. And it took about 5 months for them to write it, and then additional time for us to edit it and get it online and people to sign on to it. So this is the first sentence in the statement, and that the state must address the human dimension and environmental planning, including intentional strategies to support traditional cultures and social ties to the physical environment. Next slide. Other things that we do are to help the what's now become known as the originating communities rather than the sending communities. They didn't like being called sending communities, is to help them retain traditions that they value. So and this is one of the ways that I participate in it, with arts money. I provide funds for a tradition bearer to pass on their tradition within their community. This isn't for general consumption, or general knowledge beyond their community, but to make sure it happens within their community. Early on, we started sense of place on lost workshops in person, and then a few on Zoom. And that's where we had dialogue among art, science, and policymakers. And it was the policymakers showed up, some very significant ones. I think we were coming up with something different, and they wanted to see what in the world we were doing. Then I started realizing that the arts and culture people needed more help, needed to know more in order to dialogue with the environmentalists and the policymakers. So I developed what I can now call the Climate Migration and Welcoming Newcomers Workshop. And this is basically teaching them the basics of climate adaptation. We now have 5 working groups. We have Culture and Coastal Policy, French Language, Preparing Receiving Communities, Protecting Collections, and the 5th is Artists and Tradition Bearers. We've also started having more in-person events where we support dialogues in a local setting. That's basically kind of what we do on Zoom, but more for a local community. Next slide. I want to share these 4 resources with you. They have excellent 3 of them have excellent case studies. The first one is community-driven relocation. This was a 3-year study by the National Academies of Arts, of Science, Engineering, and Mathematics. It was just published this year. Very powerful. They're going to do another whole one on receiving communities. And another one on mental health that became evident in their study. Definitely worth looking to. Very, very dense, very powerful. The other 3 are more for the general public, or for community leaders, I guess, would be key audiences. The first is Bridging Divides, Creating Community. It came out of the immigration world. And it identifies the 4 goals for immigration and shows how arts and culture can be have strategies that can address it. The Art of Community comes out of the folklore world, but also related to the immigrant services. And again, an excellent case studies in there. And then the other is out of the National League of Cities, what cities should know about climate change and populations on the move. And they also, again, the terminology is changing, but they also talk about destination communities, and they use the term vulnerable communities. So it's interesting to see how the terminology is being renegotiated. But the most recent change in the United States is a shift towards talking about community-driven relocation rather than managed retreat. Next slide.
Got about a minute left.
Okay.
But there we are. I think we're there anyway.
Yeah. These are just that I have developed a resource list that's online, and you're welcome to look at it. And then after one of my larger workshops, I was asked to help people develop a strategic plan. And while I'm not the person that needs to be doing this, what I did do is develop a plan to plan. And it's a step-by-step way of how to identify the resources, learn about the issues, about everything. But that's it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, mate. A really, really fascinating to see, again, a very different collection of approaches and incorporating, of course, the local communities as well, and seeing where they can shape their own futures and the future of their heritage. So really fantastic to hear about that. Thank you. Let's move now then to the final speaker, Georgia Butters. So Georgia has been working in British museums and heritage organisations for over 20 years. She was instrumental in the successful delivery and operational launch of the new bridge at Intangible Castle. I went over there about a year ago, which was fantastic. A bit scary, I thought, but I'm not going to like reuniting the two halves of the castle for the first time in nearly 800 years. As a senior manager within English Heritage, Georgia leads over 100 team members to deliver safe, engaging and sustainable visitor experiences across 10 sites in Cornwall and Devon. So we're back to Cornwall to hear you, Georgia, and thanks very much indeed for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you so much. We'll go straight into the next slide so that you can see the beautiful bridge that I was just talking about. Here we are. So this is the site of Tintagel Castle, and this slide shows the two halves of the castle being reunited by the bridge in the very middle. Tintagel is set on the north coast of Cornwall, on a really jagged, rocky headland that projects out into the Atlantic Sea. And it's one of the most spectacular locations in Britain, although I might be biased because I'm calling in from the office there today. If you can do the next slide, please, Kira. The castle itself that we're referring to is medieval, and it was built by Richard, Earl of Cornwall in the 13th century. You can see a little bit on this slide of what we refer to as the island courtyard, and this is the Great Hall where much feasting took place. And in this slide, you can also see one of our interpretation panels that we have at site that focuses on the castle and how it was used. What we have at Tintagel is an awful lot of tangible heritage. We have a medieval castle, and if we move on to the next slide, we can, in the next slide, this is our orientation map. You can see the castle is in the middle, and then you can see an island, the island promontory, which has over 100 buildings on it. And these are from the 5th to the 7th centuries BCE. So they're referred to as the Dark Age or post-Roman buildings. And these hundreds of buildings across the site indicate that the site was a really, really important location post-Roman. There were large quantities of pottery found here. So much pottery was found here that Tintagel became a typology in and of itself. We have amphorae from Greece, France, North Africa, all across the Mediterranean were imported to this place, possibly in exchange for tin, but we don't have specific evidence of that. It's a highly defensible location, and recent archaeological discoveries lend weight to the theory that it was the residence of the kings of Cornwall. So there's absolute abundant archaeology across this site. We've got a really clear archaeological record, and becoming clearer every time we do a dig here. So there's really, really tangible heritage, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. What I'm here to talk about is the intangible and how we weave those two together, because at Tintagel, that's a real challenge. So in the 12th century, Tintagel emerges in the continental poems of France and Germany as being the location for the court of King Mark of Cornwall. And it's this king that features in the tale of Tristan and Iseult. It's a tragic tale of illicit love between the Cornish knight Tristan and the Irish princess Iseult, who was due to be the wife of King Mark. And so this story, this tale, was super popular in the medieval period, right across the European continent. And here in this slide, you can see an element from our exhibition that visually represents the moment where the lovers meet in a garden. Next slide, please. Then so this tale of Tristan and Iseult, super popular across the 12th and the 13th century. And then Geoffrey of Monmouth places the magical conception of King Arthur at the island fortress of Tintagel with Merlin the magician in the 13th century. And in doing this, a far greater legend was born. Here in this slide, you can see the cave of Merlin, Merlin's cave on the right-hand side, and you can see our representation, our artistic representation on the left-hand side that has been carved into the rock. And so since that time, since Geoffrey of Monmouth published the History of the Kings of Britain in the 13th century, Tintagel has been linked to King Arthur, and this really amazing legend has shaped the place. Stories of Arthur's court flourished in the medieval period. The tales of Knights of the Round Table became a pattern for a new code of chivalry. The good conduct expected from a knight towards his enemies, his lord, other knights and ladies. Importantly, English kings used the legend of King Arthur and his knights to promote their political standing and ambitions. And Richard, Earl of Cornwall, was the brother of the King of England at the time. And we believe that it was this principle, that this was a principal factor in Richard actually building the castle of Tintagel here on site. So throughout the ages, people have come to Tintagel because of the Arthurian story. And nowhere was this seen more than in the 19th century, when the Romantic poets like Tennyson, really delved into that medieval and Gothic history and brought those stories to life for a whole new audience. And then the railways were able to bring that audience to those sites. So people have always been interested in this story, and today we welcome over 250,000 people a year to Tintagel, all coming to visit with Arthur in mind. So how do we treat that intangible heritage at site? Next slide, please. For a really long period, we didn't make that association at all. Early Ministry of Works guidebooks from the 1930s right through to the 1970s and 80s deal with the architecture of the site, the archaeology, the actual tangible heritage. But today, increasingly, historians are looking at the influence of these stories. And I love Stephen's note earlier about how close the tangible and the intangible actually are. Because as we've seen here, we now think it was the intangible heritage that prompted Richard to build the castle that has become the tangible heritage of this place. So when we came to reinterpret the site in 2016, we were determined to weave the legend with the factual, without detracting from the history, but we had to tread a really fine line. We didn't want to become the Disneyfication of this site. We didn't want to become the theme park. We wanted to get a real balance. And so the way that we did that was to move away from the didactic, to move away from, you know, really detailed written information. We have that available for people, but out within the landscape, we wanted to really tweak people's emotional intelligence and take a storytelling approach. Back in the medieval period, mythology was absolutely essential to people. It was part and parcel of their life. It wasn't myth, it was fact. It was the story on which they based their lives. And they planted well, it was intrinsic within the landscape. And so that true history could be seen everywhere. And so what we've tried to do is place things within the landscape. Here in this side, you can see some children looking at a story stone from the medieval garden, which Richard built, but the story stone is about the story of Tristan and Isolde. Next slide, please. Then when we move towards the trading area and the northern ruins, we have a far more factual approach with a detailed information panel, but a beautiful representation of the pottery that was found on site. Next slide, please. And then here you can see off the island the compass point, where we have drawn the places that are associated with King Arthur into one place, and we signpost these through the compass point. So each element is pointing in the direction of that geographical location connected with Arthur. Next slide, please. So has this been successful? I think so. I think we've hit a really nice balance between the information and the emotional intelligence that connects people so that they have a lovely emotional journey as well as an informative one. And nowhere is this better seen than in this particular statue, Gallos. This was created by a sculptor, Welsh sculptor, Reuben Enyon. And Gallos is Cornish for power. And when people have got to this point on the island, they will have seen the castle built by Richard, the richest man in England at that time. They will have seen the buildings from the 5th and 7th centuries and read about the trading and the luxury goods that were being imported to that site at this time. And then when they get to this point, they can then make up their mind. Is this King Mark of Cornwall, who presided over a very rich trading depot here at Tintagel, or is this King Arthur, the legendary king who then inspired a medieval castle at a later date? It's up to them. And that's how we've retained the mystique and magic whilst also providing the information on the intangible history at Tintagel. Thank you.
Wonderful, George. That was fantastic.
And there's some kids enjoying it.
Yes.
No, move those on. Move through. They're done.
Fantastic. Thanks, great to have those pictures. And I love that statue or sculpture as well. It's kind of half tangible, half intangible, isn't it? In many ways.
Totally. The way you can see through it is just encapsulates that.
Yes, absolutely. And that really brings us really neatly to the questions. And I think we have time for a couple of these. I just want to thank again all speakers. It's been a really, really fantastic and stimulating series of talks, because we've really learned such a lot about the breadth of intangible heritage and how it's conserved, different approaches in different places. And sometimes there are the commonalities and sometimes there are big differences, of course, to state the obvious, but that's fantastic. Well done, everyone. Right, so look, we've got time for a couple of questions here, and I'll do my best to see what we have. I think one of those has been answered already. I think Richard Hughes, your question, Stephen, has been answered. There's one here from Heather Gil Freking, if that's the right pronunciation. Apologies if not. So Lucy and other speakers, why do you think that impact on potential policy or legislation is seldom successful? I think maybe this means, why do you think the impact of intangible cultural heritage on legislation or policy is seldom successful? Heather says, I work in intangible cultural heritage policy and legislation related to climate change, and noting while there is often policy and legislation that considers tangible cultural heritage, intangible cultural heritage is much more rare in law and policy. Lucy, I don't know if you want to kick us off on that, or if anyone else wants to, of the speakers, feel free. It is directed to you, Lucy, but you may have some thoughts, or if someone else has, feel free.
That's a really difficult question to answer, if I'm perfectly honest. Maybe it's in the telling, it's intangible, and it's not, so I don't know. I'm struggling with that one. I'm sorry. That's partly because of my own lack of experience.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Georgia, I think
It's a really good question.
It is a great question. Georgia, do you want to take that one? I think you might need to unmute, or Kira might need to unmute you if you're not already.
Sorry.
There we are. No.
I'm not a specialist in this area, so this is just my personal thought on the matter. And I think largely it goes back to Stephen's earlier point and Lucy's earlier point about involving communities, and whether the people that are making those decisions, or even sort of understanding wider cultural heritage, intangible cultural heritage, have any awareness of that. We do in this room, but we're not always the people making those decisions or being able to influence those decisions in a really detailed way. And I have to say that, you know, even where I'm based in Cornwall, you know, the things that Stephen and Lucy talked about earlier really rang true for me in terms of the ensuring that the Cornish minorities are heard and that their heritage is looked after as well. And that's something that within the country of the UK is not really understood that well, to be honest. So those policymakers don't always have that understanding, and it's for us to try and bring it alive for them, I would suggest.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. And I wonder if Maida, you may want to comment on that a little bit, because of the work that you've been doing with your folklore collective in terms of speaking to policy. There may well be something from your experience.
Well, quite honestly, I work in the realm of the arts. I'm not in historic preservation, so I'm not really as informed about the historic preservation legislation and policies.
But I suppose the question might be, do you think the arts has a powerful voice potentially in moving policy forward? Do you have
the arts can reach people who are never going to read a report, or much less, you know, feel it, you know, that it's a powerful motivator. So absolutely.
Yeah. And Anne, I think maybe, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, no, so that's a really good question and a really good point. And I'm speaking, you know, from my experience, primarily North America, United States. I think U.S. preservation policy currently, and in its inception, which has only been really a formalized effort and codified law since like the 60s, I think it's very locked into this concept of physical integrity, architectural integrity. So that is place-based, that is a tangible asset or a cultural resource versus a cultural landscape or a practice or an ethnography or oral history. So I do think that this is something that we deal with in the United States, trying to provision protections for other types of heritage. Even to have to do that is ridiculous, but we're talking about intangible heritage, but there's this kind of mindset that is shifting, I will say, in this country at least, that it doesn't have to be locked into a site or a cultural resource or historic property. So that might help a little bit. Doesn't help the cause, but maybe explains it.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I wonder, Lucy, did you want to come back on that? I saw your...
Well, no, I was just thinking about the nature of intangible as well, because sometimes, you know, different things resonate more with policymakers, you know, and quite often that, I mean, those activities relating to knowledge and to do with the sea, particularly in places like Tanzania, when maybe other activities more ritual based actually, or myth, or the sort of things that Georgia was talking about, perhaps have more resonance than knowledge of fishing banks. You know, that just doesn't feature at all. So sometimes it is the nature of the intangible as well. But
yes, indeed. Stephen, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly, Lucy. So, I mean, the reason policymakers focus on tangible is it's just much easier because it's a building. It doesn't move, doesn't talk back to you, doesn't get angry with you, etc. As an architect, that's what, I mean, I appreciate that about buildings, I must say. But what's clear on the East African coast is that there's many competing narratives. Somewhere like Kua, and this is a little bit answering Richard's question in the chat. There are the narratives of to put it bluntly, the people who captured and enslaved people and the people who were enslaved by those captured, and these narratives about what Kua represents, in some cases, are in conflict. And so, which story do you tell? Which story do you preserve? I mean, do we make a distinction between his story and her story? Very often, very, very different versions of the same event. I mean, intangible heritage is such a difficult thing to grasp, to describe, I think, in many respects. And maybe it's just looking through the architect's eyes. I sometimes wonder whether actually it's even possible at all to talk in such terms, or to talk in preserving such terms. Yeah, I mean, we could talk for hours about this, but it's a complicated one. Yeah,
that's right. Which sadly we don't have, but fascinating question, really useful one, I think, to get so many different angles from the experiences and perspectives we've all got here together. And I think, as Stephen, you quite rightly said, we could at least devote another half hour at least to this. What I would like to do, though, is get into the breakout groups for the discussion, because I think that will be really, really interesting, so that we can then maybe take this a little bit further in terms of exploring how the speakers have challenged our thinking today, and how we might approach the sort of conservation really of intangible and Indigenous heritage. I think that would be really useful. So what we'll do in a second, we'll put you into the breakout rooms, and we'll repost the questions that we're going to give to you for each breakout room in the chat. And there will also be a Padlet, as usual, where there's a link. You can click on the link and then add some notes from the discussion, so that we can record some of the points made in that discussion, which is really, really useful. So do feel free to use those. And then we'll come back in again to the main room and have a brief feedback. So I think what we'll do, let's see, if we can do this for about 20 minutes or so, I think that'd be really useful. And then we'll have another feedback at the end to make sure we've captured most of the points. But just another shout out to all our speakers. Thanks very much indeed for your brilliant presentations and getting us thinking. There's so much to think about there. So hold fire for a second. You should be redirected, and then you should find yourself in a breakout room, and we'll continue the discussions there. I think most of us have come back that are here, which is good. I know that we're pretty much on time, so we don't have a lot of time to go through the breakouts. But I hope you've had some really good discussions. We did in our group, which was fantastic, actually. So let's see then if we can just get a couple of points to be fed back. So shall we have something from group? And if it's group 1 or 2, Lucy, I think maybe you were in one of those groups. Yes. Oh, there we go. I think you might need to.
George has got the palette thing.
Yeah.
If you're happy, George. Sorry.
Great.
I didn't.
Go to Amy after you, I think, and then I'll do a roundup of mine.
Okay. So we felt that there were such different approaches that sort of really showed the challenges of dealing with intangible heritage are really varied, and that co-creation is an absolutely massive part of it. And there was a really good point made around our case studies mostly talked about actually turning the intangible into the tangible. So we're taking a myth and turning it into a statue, or we're capturing oral history on a tape that is then managed in some way. And so we're basically trying to create something that can then be managed, which I thought was a really interesting point. Please do chip in, anyone, around that. But we also thought that there's a real danger of investing in things that then when that project comes to an end or we leave, what then happens to it? What's the legacy of that? And that sometimes things just come to an end and that's okay. And we also talked about the impact of visitors on an area and how this can really change a place and create tensions in communities when they feel that things are being done to them, and the things that are a real important part, that we're describing as intangible heritage or Indigenous heritage are changed because tourists need certain facilities or things need to be put in place. So that was also something that we talked about.
Brilliant. So, lots of different pressures and needs to to fulfill, beyond and within the community as well. I think, and obviously for some sites, not all, tourism management is going to feature as part of that, which is something we have to bear in mind as well. So yeah, fantastic. What a great range of things there. Thanks, Georgia. That's brilliant. Amy, should we go to you next? I think you're in a different group.
Right. I was in group 1, but Maida, I think you were taking notes. So I wonder if you might be able to take over.
What have you find?
We focused on stories and the challenges of finding the stories. One site had a gap in the history. They know nothing about 150 years about the site. The challenges of collecting them. Darren talked about and services that his business can do. He focuses on collecting family stories, but he feels like what he does could apply broader. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. Amy, anything else?
Yeah, I did. I think we talked about also how stories are really what capture imaginations and are really powerful tools. And so maybe there's a way to use those more intentionally. And I don't know, I think there was something beautiful going on in our group where we really were making connections, and some of our members were offering help to others. And I think there's going to be some connecting afterwards.
Well, that's excellent.
Yeah.
That's excellent. That's one of the great things I think about these discussions as well, to bring people together where, you discover actually there's quite a lot of maybe similar challenges that we all have. But I really like that idea as well, of course, of focusing on stories, because in a way, I suppose it's one of the most, how can I put it, kind of accessible and democratic ways that you can maybe encapsulate and enhance perhaps some of the intangible heritage through telling stories. And the story that you make, particularly collectively, can be incredibly powerful as well, and have lots of different modes of transmission and communication, and perhaps actually inclusion as well. So, I'm sure you know all this already, but I think it's a very good thing to focus on the practice of storytelling. So that sounds excellent. So I'll just summarize what we spoke about in group 3, I think it was. But again, Stephen and particularly Heather, if you want to chip in, feel free to do this. I think as with Georgia, we were impressed by the level of co-creation and co-production, and we thought that was really encouraging across the presentations, and this drive to meet the community's needs, maybe rather than purely focus on a research agenda. I think that was one of the key things that was quite striking about challenging the perspectives, maybe intangible cultural heritage and how it had been approached in many ways before. We focused a little bit on wetlands and coasts in terms of whether these environments actually perhaps have a special place or have a special characteristic, because maybe there is this enhanced focus due to potential real loss of intangible cultural heritage. So because of rapid rates of climate change and the movement of communities, there's maybe a real sense of urgency in wanting to maybe capture what may be vanishing. And then we changed focus a little bit and looked at particularly that sort of interface between the perspectives of heritage that's intangible and intangible, particularly within an African context. Of course, we had Stephen in our group, and thinking that so much of African heritage is seen through the lens of sort of European influence and European impact. So that intangible cultural heritage inland perhaps matters precisely because it was going on far in the past before the Europeans in a way turned up. And this idea of perhaps African cultural heritage seen through a European lens is maybe more useful because those areas that are on the edge of the African world that perhaps had those interactions with the rest let's say, of the world at the time, particularly with Europeans in terms of colonization. So there is that real distinction. And then finally, we were looking at Canada and talking about drafting definitions of. Heather in our group was talking about British definition, and that is a really sensible thing, we felt, for lots of reasons, not just because those questions of perhaps how one or how a group can compensate for the loss of intangible cultural heritage due to climate migration might become more and more of a bigger challenge. So actually having a definition is something that can be really, really useful. But hopefully, through all of those discussions, you've managed to capture some of it on Padlet, where we've got the link that will enable us to have a look at those in a little bit more detail, and we'll make those available so that obviously you can see in a bit more detail what we're talking about. But for now, I think we need to draw this to a close. We're kind of just over time. So I just want to, again, thank everyone, particularly our speakers. So again, Anne, Stephen, Lucy, Major and Georgia, those that were facilitating the discussions, particularly Kira Shine, my colleague back in London, who's been managing the slides and conducting the logistics for today. So thanks very much indeed to her, and making sure that everything runs smoothly. Again, what we'll do is make the recording for this, we'll edit it, make sure that it's available. We're still waiting for some of those to go online with the other resources on the Coastal Connections website, but when they do, we'll let you know when that happens. And bear in mind that next time, what we'll be looking at in a month's time, well, just under a month's time actually, it's on the 16th of July, is Policy, Principles and Practice, which is the final workshop in this series. And rather interestingly, it would be excellent to continue some of these discussions, particularly if we're thinking about intangible heritage, when we think about what makes for good policy. So we've already got some really good speakers lined up for those. Some will be talking about Zanzibar, for example, as well as the UK and some other places, but to give us an idea of how that can be more effective as a process of policy making. Just one other reminder, really, again, if you haven't already done it, the survey, it'd be great if you could fill that out, particularly if you're from a postal heritage site, to make those available. That would be really, really useful. And again, what we'll be doing with those, just to see that Eleonora has might ask the very, very pertinent question about the past workshops being accessible somewhere. Yeah, they're going to be, the recordings will be up on the website very soon, along with lots of other resources, including the fact sheets that we are making for each of the sites. So Hurst Castle was the first of those, and we've been building a compendium of examples of case studies, each of which then goes into a bit more detail about challenges, solutions, outlook of each of these sites, to help you find the information you need, particularly from a case study basis. So thanks everyone indeed, and it's been fantastic, really, as Terry's already mentioned in the chat there, for sharing your work so generously. I couldn't agree more. It's been fantastic, and we look forward to seeing you next time, the 16th of July. So thanks very much indeed, and take care. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.